As a soulless virus spread, vulnerability and disparity bred. A nation that can lead the way, guided by head and gilded by heart. Alas, saw the divide drift further apart. To rise above prejudice and give way to justice. To embrace every human with equity and dignity. It's time for true humanity. Our tomorrow calls out to us, invoking passion and purpose. And what each one of us does today can influence our way of living and rise as a nation of a billion thriving.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Dasra Philanthropy Week 2021. This is the 12th edition and our first virtual one. So congratulations to the Dasra team as well. The theme for for this year's forum is A Billion Thriving. And DPW marks the beginning of this movement that each one of us must make our own. If there is one takeaway that I want you to walk away with through our sessions this week, is that we urgently need to shift the conversation to talk not only about surviving, but also thriving. We can enable our most vulnerable to thrive only when each of us embraces a strong lens of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. That is the Jedi lens in all our work. Last year has been a hard year for each of us, especially the communities that we serve. And there has never been more of an important time for us to come together and drive some of these conversations. So thank you so much for taking the time out and being here in the session today. This session is part of something that we're calling our Learning Lab series, and it is specifically designed to enable deep conversations, curate insights, connect and build on each other's ideas. So we have a great conversation lined up with some fantastic speakers. But before we begin, let me take you through some session guidelines, which will be important for us as we go through this discussion. So to begin with, if I could just request everybody, all the participants, to change their name, if you can, to rename yourselves to your name as well as the organization. If you have any issues with technology, you can privately message anyone with the Dasra team name next to them. We are live streaming this. We will be using social media live for this. And I encourage everyone who's participating to also please share and amplify these sessions. And finally, we do have a robust agenda plan for you, so we will keep to time. I apologize in advance if I'm a bit of a strict time monitor, but that's just to ensure that we're making the most of this conversation. Okay. So we can now begin. Let me start off with a little bit of a context of this session, the topic, and welcome you really to this session, which is called Sunrises in the East, Exploring the Intersections Between Climate Change and Adolescents. I want to share with you a little bit of the intention of where we started out this, the mission for this conversation and where we've ended up. So I'm Shelja from the Dasra team. I'm your moderator for this session. In our work through the 10 to 19 Adolescents Collaborative that Dasra heralds, we heard across a lot of organizations and practitioners that there is an issue that is faced by young boys and girls, which is closely related and has implications to the struggle around climate justice. And let me share 5 quick data points with you. So as per the 2016 to 18 Comprehensive National Nutrition Survey, 40% of adolescent girls in India suffer from anemia. According to UNICEF, we have one of the largest number of child brides in the world residing in India. We all know this. We have discussed this a number of times. Less than 2% of the 184 national climate strategies mention anything to do with girls and their rights. And there is some understanding, I'm not sure if it is verified with evidence, but there is some anecdotal data that says for every additional year of schooling a girl receives, her country's resilience to climate disasters improves. So we decided with the India Climate Collaborative, in partnership with them, let's delve deeper into this issue and let's understand these implications better by developing a report that really brings together these two issues, adolescence on one side and climate change and climate justice on the other side. But we were confronted with a really peculiar issue, which is we didn't get enough data. Even if we were exploring secondary data, anecdotal data, we weren't able to get enough information or evidence that really brings these two pieces together in a meaningful way. Now, that itself is a call to action. And we'll get into that as we come into the conversation. But with that, then what we were left to do is to pull together something called, we're calling it a framing document for lack of a better word, and a framing document that pulls together as much information as we could bring together on this linkage between adolescence and climate change, climate justice, and sustainability. So with that long introduction, I want to pass on to my colleague Park San, who will take us through some of the emerging thoughts that we have kind of developed, and that will take us into the next part of the conversation, which will be a facilitated roundtable discussion. Over to you, Park San.
Well, thank you so much, Shelja. To start off with, I think, ladies and gentlemen, as Shelja said, that this is a framing document or a spotlighting document, and we really owe it to the existing knowledge out there for us to be able to even bring this together. And I would start off by saying that no one is more affected by climate change than children and adolescents. According to research, a child born today could be living in a world with an average temperature that is 4 degrees warmer by their 71st birthday. Well, why does that matter? A warmer world means more diseases, more displacement, major health and livelihood problems, and even early deaths. When gender is added to the considerations of age, that is when specifically when we focus on adolescents and adolescent girls, there is an added layer of vulnerability and impact. Climate change and its consequences not only reflect existing inequalities faced by adolescent girls, but they deepen them, ultimately pushing them further into the vicious cycle of intergenerational poverty, vulnerability, and marginalization. For example, the floods of 2017 damaged over 7,000 schools in India alone. And we know very well that girls in India are often the first to drop out of school to augment household income, and many of them don't return to education. During a drought, for example, women and girls travel long distances to fetch water, resulting in a myriad of health issues such as arthritis, anemia, malnutrition, and several mental health problems. Rising temperatures, erratic rainfall parameters, and patterns make them even more prone to diseases and infections such as dengue and asthma, and even depression and anxiety. Coastal erosion, sea level rises, glacial retreats all result in what we call gradual migration. And as these events occur, families face increased debt and poverty as they migrate. And out of desperation, young girls are either married off as children or fall prey to sex and labor trafficking. Now, while adolescents remain disproportionately vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, climate action cannot be successful if it does not involve them in driving solutions. Despite successes at the international level, the role of adolescents in India's climate movement still remains muted. The media does not talk enough about how young girls are leading the fight against the climate crisis. Few programs focus on them for adaptation, and funding by local philanthropists towards climate change and adolescents is extremely limited. Without making young people's voices heard and involving them as a key part of the decision making processes, climate action will not be effective or sustainable. And so, what do we recommend? We're basically recommending 6 pathways, simple pathways to enable this engagement. One, embed climate change adaptation into education curricula to create greater awareness and knowledge amongst adolescents themselves. Adapt a strong and intentional focus on adolescents when designing climate change programs. Advocate for inclusive climate change laws and policies that are responsive to the needs of adolescents. Drive greater funding to initiatives or programs that are designed for and with adolescents. Build capacity of young people to leverage their voice and engage meaningfully in the discourse around climate change. And lastly, strengthen research and data, as Shelja mentioned earlier, around the intersections between climate change and adolescence. Finally, I would like to say this. It is not surprising to witness the angst that many young people experience when they imagine the world that they will inherit. Greta Thunberg was far from the first young person to speak up, to hold the powerful accountable for their inaction on climate change, and she definitely won't be the last. Youth across the world, and increasingly in India, see themselves on the generational front line of climate change. More of them need to be educated of the impacts of climate change, be provided with platforms to voice their collective concerns, and be supported to partner with communities and governments to secure a safer, healthier, and happier future for themselves and for India at large. And on that very note, we do hope that this little framing document is a start for many such conversations that we're going to have today. And with that, back to you, Shelja.
Thanks, Paksan. Thank you. That was useful to share. I just want to, sum up what Paksan said with a couple of things. All of this information has been collected through secondary data sources, some literature review. We had to pull it together quite quickly to be able to bring it to the session. And like Paksan said, for us, this is the start of collecting this information and pushing the agenda that we need to. Sorry, I went on mute. I'll just repeat myself to say that it's important for us to understand that now is the start for us to explore this intersectionality. We did refer to various reports, the Lancet report, the PwC report with Save the Children, some of the UNICEF framing and Plan International. And we have done this in partnership with the India Climate Collaborative. But also that for us, today's session is a little bit of an experiment. What we're hoping is not only for this session to be for the participants to hear and listen to us, but for the discussants and participants, we're going to document what you're saying, and we're going to pull together. I can't say it's a data-backed document. I will not call it a research document. It's a document that will pull together perspectives from young people who are in this conversation as participants, some experts, funders, a multi-sectoral practitioner's point of view on why this intersectionality needs to be explored, and let therefore this session and everything that you say be a clarion call to action to say we need to invest in this in whichever way we can to explore this further, because like Paksan said, and like a lot of research says, the communities that are impacted most through climate change are the ones also that are doing the most to address it. So with that, I want to open up this conversation to discussion. So for the audience who's tuned in, we're going to do this. We're going to try and recreate as we would do in a live conversation. We're going to bring together a few panelists. So if I could ask the Dasra Tech team to now bring in some of my panelists. To begin with, we're going to bring in Shloka Nath, the Acting Director at India Climate Collaborative, Lynn Smitham, co-founder and board member of the Kiowa Trust, and Namrata Rao, Research Coordinator, Center on Gender Equity and Health. Welcome. Hello. Hi. Hi to all of you. Okay. Hi. So to begin with, I thought I would just start off with a few questions, but really the idea is to build off of each other's responses. And also to all my other discussants here, I request you to please keep your video on and also come in and share your comments on chat. I want to just encourage the group that's tuned in to continue and add your perspectives and comments. Like I said, it's really valuable for us to have that. So please continue putting that on chat. But for this conversation, let me start off, Namrata, with you, because we started with talking about that data doesn't exist. And you know, I had read somewhere some economists saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, if you torture data long enough, it will confess. I'm not sure there's too much of a confession that's come through here. But my question to you is there any data that or anecdotal evidence information that talks about this linkage and implications of climate on adolescents? Can you give us a better sense?
Sure. So there is a lot of data linking climate change in adolescents, specifically girls, but unfortunately, I did not find anything on India. Like you had alluded to, certainly climate change has adverse health effects on adolescent girls. There is evidence from Bangladesh, Mozambique, Nepal, all these other low and middle income countries linking extreme weather events to early or forced marriage, because that you know such weather events usually lead to loss of crops, loss of land. These are all economic shocks. So you get your daughter married off early because dowry is cheaper then, or if you're in a country that practices bride price, it's just then a source of income, right? To get your daughter married off early. So there is evidence from other countries, and I think we can look at those directions in India, but I don't, I've unfortunately not found enough evidence or enough robust evidence from India. And then, the third factor that I would like to talk about is there's qualitative evidence linking climate change with gender-based violence. I didn't find much quantitative or, making like a causal impact. But one, of course, is these economic shocks. You have all these abuses in humanitarian and relief camps. But also on the day-to-day effects of climate change, adolescent girls often have to walk longer to collect firewood, walk longer to fetch water. And there are reports saying, there is sexual harassment on the way. So, there is evidence that can help us in India or those working on climate change in India to kind of, let's look at these indicators and let's see what exactly is happening here. There surely is there are enough data sources in India to at least do some robust secondary data analysis, but by and large, it's a giant black hole at the moment. Yeah.
Thanks, Namrata. I'm going to come back to you, but let me just come to Shloka first. Shloka, a standard question, right? Does climate change differently or disproportionately impact adolescents, particularly girls, in the Indian context? And can you share your perspective on that?
Sure. Thank you, Sheldra, and thanks for having me on this panel today. I think it's a really important issue that we're discussing, and we at the India Climate Collaborative are incredibly glad and to be part of this journey with Dasra. It's a really big question, so I'm going to try and break it down as best I can. But I'm sure in the discussion we'll come back to it and I can add to it. To address the issue of climate change and its impact on adolescents, and particularly on adolescent girls, we do need to first understand India's climate crisis a little bit more holistically. I think the first thing that is important to know is that we are as in India, that is in a unique position, not only because we're incredibly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, but we also have tremendous responsibility towards our next generation because we are the third largest emitter in the world. And as we develop, our share of emissions is only expected to go up. And there is this widespread perception that climate action is going to drive attention away from the things that truly matter to people on the ground, especially in a developing country like India. And we just can't afford that. But the reality is also that climate will not wait for us to develop. So we have to find a way to address climate change and development issues at the same time. We have to invest in climate and development solutions that produce double and triple wins. And that's that sweet spot in the middle called co-benefits, where climate and development go hand in hand. And it's in times like these, in the middle of a debilitating global pandemic, that we realize that we're actually advocating for the same things. So I really want to emphasize the fact that good development is actually a bedrock to climate resilience. It involves all of the things that we are struggling with today, whether it's investing in social safety nets, investing in high quality accessible healthcare, investing in water resilient structures and climate resilient agriculture. In the end, the goal is completely the same. We want fewer people at risk. I think within this model, we do need to acknowledge that the climate crisis impacts different groups differently. And the greatest impacts will be on marginalized and vulnerable communities. And even within these communities, there is a pressing need to develop context-specific solutions because of the various ways in which climate impacts manifest. So for women and adolescents whose livelihoods depend on natural resources such as agriculture or fishing, they are impacted very differently by a changing climate than marginalized women in urban areas. So adolescents living in the coastal Konkan region will require adaptations that are completely distinct from adolescents living in drought-prone districts of Maharashtra or the hills in Assam. We do need to recognize that we cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach to deal with a crisis of this scale as well as urgency. And so really, due to these factors, India does need to plan. We do have to accommodate this key demographic in our recovery measures, adolescent girls. And I think just to reiterate sort of the point that you made, 1 in every 10 Indians is an adolescent girl. It accounts for more than 20% of the world's 500 million population of adolescent girls. We have a huge number of that in our country. And adolescence is a time of key transitions, from girlhood to womanhood, from primary to secondary education, from education to work and family life. And too often these transitions go wrong. We have very high dropout rates from secondary school. We have poor quality and inappropriate education. I mean, the list goes on, and I won't delve into that now. But we know that adolescence is also the time when gender roles for girls become more entrenched. And in many developing countries like India, their lives become limited to that domestic sphere. And this seclusion brings with it greater exposure to a range of risks. In many societies, gender discrimination also means that family poverty has a greater impact on girls who are fed less. They're less likely to have access to healthcare. They're less likely to go to schools. So you can imagine, if you layer climate change on top of that, you're going to see more poverty. And these disadvantages are only going to increase and will prevent an even greater number of girls from realizing their rights, with particular impact as they reach adolescence. So I'll pause here and hand it back to you, Shelja.
No, thanks, Luca. It's interesting to note the difference or the nuances of a vulnerable group. And then within that, we talk about women and gender. And then within that is also sometimes we hear this word thrice vulnerable, which is adolescent girls for various reasons. So with that framing, Lynn, just coming to you for the same question in that sense, and to have your perspective on why is it important to focus on this linkage, and how does one really understand these implications?
Thank you, Shelja. And thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. It's an issue that I'm feeling increasingly engaged in and urgent about, because, as you know, we've worked for 10 years with adolescent girls in India, but we definitely understand that they will be victims of climate change unless we act quickly to help make them more resourceful, and to give them the tools that are going to help them to come through this, not just as victims, but actually as leaders. So Yes, I completely agree with you, Shloka, that girls are absolutely and increasingly affected by climate change. And we can already see that in climate vulnerable parts of the world, that typically those people who are living in those areas are already poor. They're already disadvantaged. And then we all know that women and girls are seriously more disadvantaged in poverty than men and boys. So that, like you said, they're already sort of at the bottom of the pyramid in terms of access to resources. But then when you layer on that the fact that girls typically are less educated, so even if they're in progressive schools where education around climate change is being mentioned, they don't have an understanding of it. They're less physical because, especially in the Indian context, they're not encouraged like boys are to go out and do as much physical stuff, play as much sport, run around as much, do things that are on their own from a really early age, taking initiative. And all of those qualities that we need to start nurturing in girls make them even more vulnerable. We know that in the tsunami in Thailand, that actually many more girls died because they couldn't climb trees and they couldn't run away from the disaster. So even down to the sort of physical level of helping girls just own their bodies and be more physical can be ways to help them be less vulnerable. I think the other thing is that they have a lot less power. Although we're working obviously very hard to help girls have more voice and more choice, they're not as used to voicing themselves, speaking up for what they need as boys are encouraged to be. And so with less power, you exercise less initiative. And when a crisis hits, you can't lean in and step into it with a sense of power, with a sense of being able to do something about it. So all of those things are just making the girl, as you say, thrice disadvantaged. But girls really don't have to be the victims. If we put the right tools in place to help them now, then they can start to be leaders of climate change. They can start to be activists. They can be significantly more resourceful, and that will help. If you take the Drawdown project, which was actually started in 2014, by a group of eminent scientists who were looking at the 10 most impactful solutions for the world to reduce or impact climate change. Then one of them included education for all, but specifically for women and girls, and family planning. And those are both initiatives that, well, certainly education needs to continue for a long time for girls, but family planning needs to be taught to girls from the earliest age so that they do start to feel they have choice over how many children they have, when they have them. If that doesn't happen, by 2050, there'll be about 16 billion people on the planet. That is one heck of a heavy footprint. So I'll stop there.
Wow, what a statement to end that. But, Namrata, I'm just going to come back to you for a minute here and reference something that Lynn and I had spoken earlier, where Lynn, you've shared a lot of the information around, again, implications of climate on gender, on women. And based on what Lynn just said, what Shloka said, Namrata, if you were to be asked, what are the 3 critical areas one needs to invest in to get more data around, evidence around? Like you said, there is some that's anecdotal, there's some that's qualitative. If I were to ask you, you're getting $5 million right now to do one research project. What are the 3 pieces that you would like to invest in to see critical information come through that will make a compelling case for this linkage to be analyzed? What would you say?
Okay, thanks. So I think the first, my first immediate step would be looking at what data sources we have in the country. And I think we have plenty. You know, we have a lot of gender equity indicators in the NFHS, the NSS, World Bank. We also have a lot of climate change indicators from the Indian Forest State Reports, weather patterns. And I think the first would be to really do some robust secondary data analysis. Climate change is not merely an environmental problem. Like, you have to look at the intersection between gender, agriculture, weather, rainfall, land holding. So I think the first thing I would be that I would push for and also be very excited for would be to use the data we have and get some really robust analyses going. The second thing, I think, I'm glad there are funders also listening. The second thing, I think what we need are strong, valid and reliable survey tools. We do have very good measures to study gender, but we don't have them, or study gender equity, but we don't have them in the context of climate change. And we don't have them in the context of climate change in a country like India. And I'd like to make a little plug here for adolescent mental health, because all the tools that we have were developed in the global north, and they need to be adapted better to suit the Indian context, especially if you want to study it in the dynamic context that is climate change in India. And I think the third area, again, that I see a lot of scope in is to do, we like Lynn mentioned, we have a lot of adolescent programming in the country. What I would like to see is layer climate change on it. We don't have to start from scratch, right? There's already good groundwork being laid. Layer climate change on it and do some really robust impact assessments, like do some RCTs, use these research methods that we have to generate the evidence, because like we've established, there is not enough data, and we really need good data, good evidence really quickly. Those would be my 3 areas.
No, that's really useful to hear. And what's interesting is that you mentioned a lot of these data sources exist. It's about using some of these instrument sources to do better analyses, really.
Yeah, I think it comes down to getting these different actors that are used to working in their silos on the same table. And I think this platform tries to address that. I work in a gender organization, and we don't look at forest reports, or we don't look at land holding even, and I think that is something certainly we can do if we partner with the right people, or, get economists on board, because we need evidence in or from India to influence policy in India. We have evidence from Bangladesh, from say like sub-Saharan countries, but it's not enough.
No, thanks for that, Namrata. And just for a minute, coming back to you, Lynn, based on again what Namrata said and what you shared with us. One of the things that we hear is that this is what you ended with, is this is such a big issue. It's going to affect so many. How it's going to affect all of us is in a way evident. Where do you think we can bring in partnerships to push for this, coming from, again, a lens of a practitioner, starting to understand this field better? Where do you see, and again, maybe use the framing of 3 things that we need to partner on further to push for this issue a little more systematically?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Shelja. And I so agree with your point, Namrata, about seeing this as a very intersectional issue and making sure that we bring in the threads and include a bigger audience in the discussions and in the decisions, because actually only then can we have climate solutions that are really going to work for us all. But I think there is definitely evidence. There's a lot of evidence about how climate change is going to affect women. And if we assume that, women are at what age do you become a woman? I guess it's somewhere in your late teens, isn't it? Where you're starting to make transition into being a real adult. You look at things like land rights, and there's clear evidence that if more women had access to land and owned the land, that they bring very much more climate adapted solutions to that land, and they teach their daughters how to farm that land in very effective climate adapted ways. So bringing voices like that in to understand, I think the other thing is that we need to think about helping more women and girls to be economically empowered, because when they are, and when they move from school into a period where they're skilling, girls I'm talking about, then as they grow up, they have much more resources to play with. So again, talking to people who are skilling women, and I'm not just talking about in climate adapted jobs, but women entrepreneurs. There are many projects that are conservation projects where women can be entrepreneurs, they can earn money, they get much less gender-based violence, they get more respect, all of the good things that come with women starting to earn money and getting a voice, make them less resilient, less vulnerable in climate change. I think also thinking about helping to build a pipeline of leaders, helping to really support people who are interested in this area, who show some passion for it, because we definitely need more female voices at the table on climate change. And currently there isn't sufficient pipeline in terms of women leaders, either in climate science, in science generally, or even just in policy making. So when you look at countries that have got particularly good records of emission reduction and very strong policy, the research is starting to show that they're led by women, or that they have significantly more women at the table. Well, these qualities of leadership get embedded very young. We need to start seeing girls as tomorrow's potential leaders, and we need to start nurturing those qualities in girls. So broader education than just getting a girl in school, helping to mentor her, coach her, finding ways to really champion her so that she can step up to those sorts of roles gradually as she gets older.
Thanks, Lynn. And just circling back to you, Shloka, for the last 2 minutes of this segment, what really is stopping some of this evidence analysis, these partnerships? And I come to you more from having a bird's eye view as part of being, leading the India Climate Collaborative. What's the pulse? What's the tone? What are people saying, not saying? Why is some of this not being explored further?
So I think, again, what you've highlighted is a really crucial, piece of the work that we have to do. And it's also wonderful that you've brought us all together today to discuss this. And I think, our partnership is sort of the first step in that direction. I think a couple of reasons. One is to sort of come back to what Lynn highlighted earlier, which I think is a really crucial point about the fact that adolescent girls really serve as important levers of change. And that's not often a narrative that we're bringing out enough at all. In fact, we tend to sort of draw upon the common perception that they are, victims of their circumstances, and of course of the impact of things like climate change. But really, in effect, they do actually have the potential to both stimulate our economy as well as develop climate resilience. And their agency is going to be crucial for tackling future challenges of climate change adaptation. They're capable of identifying and taking actions that will really help protect themselves as well as their communities. But In order for this potential to be realized, organizations that are working on women's and girls' rights must be given the opportunity to contribute. Acknowledging, as I said, women and girls as vulnerable groups is simply not enough. Governments and civil societies do need to allocate climate change adaptation funding to enable girls to be effective agents of change. Signatories to the UNFCCC have acknowledged that the impact of climate change on vulnerable groups, yet what this means for some of the world's most at risk is not very clear. In particular, when it comes to fulfilling the rights and needs of adolescents girls, it's barely acknowledged in the policies being developed to tackle climate change, which is why, for instance, even when putting the report together, there was such a sort of effort to find that data. I think finally, it's really important to also just highlight that, while gender has been increasingly factored into international climate policy, progress in India has been slow to reduce those gender-based disparities and to involve women in climate change mitigation and adaptation, as well as disaster risk reduction policy decisions and management. Civil society and philanthropists, we have to adopt a climate and gender lens by planning skilling, training programs for women's employment. We have to promote a focus on green jobs. We have to improve women's access to rights. And overall, adolescents, girls' lives and prospects, they must be better protected. So we're only going to achieve climate justice by addressing the gender dimensions of climate change. And the girls themselves, their skills, their knowledge, their energy, they must be part of this search for solutions. Back to you, Shelja.
Thanks, Shloka. And I'm going to take some of what you said in this segment to my next segment, if I may, which is bringing in the funder perspective to Mothushi and Heather. And a quick introduction for the both of you again: Mothushi Sengupta, Director, India MacArthur Foundation, and Heather McRae, Director, Climate Justice Resilience Fund. So welcome, Mothushi, Heather. I am fairly new to the subject myself, and I was looking up a few things that have been said, and what struck me is Ban Ki-moon saying we are the first generation that can end poverty. We are the last generation that can end climate change. Based on what you heard, the previous three panelists talking about, why are we not investing enough in this issue? Why are we not investing enough in a preventative lens? Because when you invest in anything adolescent girls do, it is not a curative lens, it is preventative, it's cost effective. It helps us to do it early in a better manner, in a more cost effective manner. So first to you, Mothushi, can you share with us a perspective from being a funder, but more broadly, understanding how funders' mandates may play or not play into this? Can you shine a little bit of a light on this?
Thank you, Shalja. This is very helpful. So I work with the MacArthur Foundation. It's a private foundation in the US. We've maintained physical presence in India for over 25 years now. And in fact, for the larger part of our presence in India, the foundation has been supporting work on reproductive health and working with the youth as such. And very recently, we have sort of shifted focus to climate change. So our work has actually strides over both the pillars that you're talking of, but not in a way that both elements have been present together so far. I'll explain this a little more as I move forward. So between 1995 to 2014, the main area of work that MacArthur supported was in the area of reproductive health and promoting women's choices and women's agency in making the right choices as far as their families are concerned. And then following internal discussions and looking at what was becoming far more important to tackle, and we sort of shifted attention to looking at climate change. Our entry point has been from the point of view of reducing gigatons of GHG gases in the atmosphere, either as it stands now or basically in the future. So given India's very specific conditions, we said that what would really make sense in the Indian context is to support action which enables India to continue growing on its development trajectory, but on a low carbon growth path. So, how do you enable policymakers? How do you enable different critical stakeholder groups make those choices so that the country continues to achieve its economic aspirations and at the same time is able to meet its climate commitments? And why do I say that? As was mentioned, and Shloka said this very articulately in the last session, India happens to be the third largest emitter in absolute terms, but per capita consumption of energy is still very low as such. So though the per capita consumption levels are low, I don't think we can actually, take it easy as such, because in absolute numbers, it's still a very high number. And given the way the country is poised to move over the next few years, emissions are only likely to grow. So the last between 2015 and 2020, the foundation has supported several organizations to conduct research, undertake demonstration pilots, and also build evidence which would actually enable policymakers and different groups to make those choices actually as we move forward. Whether it is with respect to the nationally determined contribution targets that Government of India has made, or whether it was to roll out very aggressively the expansion of solar rooftops, the policies that have been in place, or if it were, in many situations, just to look for opportunities for, striking gold with energy efficiency measures. So it's been a very interesting journey over the last 5 years. And in 2020, in the middle of this pandemic, the foundation went through a major strategic review to say that, are we in the right direction? Because it was very clear to us that even as a funding institution, we could see several changes in the ecosystem. So in 2015, we were one of the very few organizations who invested in climate change mitigation in India as such. But in 2020, there are several more, and that is a very clear indication of the level of funder interest in this whole area as such. So we have several others, and some of my peer institutions are present in this conversation as I'm speaking. Just looking at the list of participants there, there's been a very clear, clearly there's growing awareness on the subject and an interest to engage with this much more. But what was interesting was that in 2020, when we went back to the board with our understanding of what had changed in the field and what was becoming even more important to address, based on the various conversations that we had, the reports that we commissioned, we came to the conclusion saying that, yes, it's very important to continue the work that we were doing. However, it was very important to build in a very strong human-centric approach as we move forward. And what do I mean by a human-centric approach? As an institution, we've always prided ourselves to say that, we wanted to have communities, individuals, households quite at the center of our grant-making processes as such. But in the last 5 years, we were also quite new to this space of climate change mitigation, and we were trying to figure out what was important as such. And I think we have made really, really good progress in many ways. And what has really worked to our favor is also a very strong and clear direction from the topmost political leadership in terms of expanding solar, looking at ways by which we can save energy. So there's been a lot of policy making which has happened, and the action towards mitigation has actually just strengthened over the many years that we have seen behind us. But what we realized that we were missing out on very clearly was not having a lens for, which brought the community in the center. And going forward, Shalija, and looking at the data you presented in the earlier session and hearing the speakers, there was no getting away from this fact. We had to make clear that, that the grant making strategy had to shift to bring in a much clearer articulation on bringing the communities in the center. And how are we proposing to do that? We are proposing to do that in two ways at this point in time. One is to have a separate vertical which we are calling as a just transition vertical, where we are going to pick up project ideas and grants for support, which look at making the process of transition a more equitable one, so that the communities which are really at the most vulnerable end of this climate change phenomena get a better dispensation and more support than the others as such. So we want to do that. Even with the other pillars, we want to make just transition as a horizontal lens as well. So there's a vertical lens and an horizontal lens, just making sure that we want to understand the impact on communities much better. While in saying that, while some of the ideas are clearly there to say, okay, fine, can we support people in terms of making the transition to new livelihoods? If ag is supporting in a way in that where extreme weather events or extreme heat conditions are making it impossible for people to pursue their existing livelihoods, can we actually bring in other forms and help people make that move? Those are there, and there's some discussion happening. But Shelja, I think we are also trying to figure out what does this package really mean. And when we talk about communities, again, we recognize it's not a homogeneous mix. I mean, so issues around social divisions and whether it's talking about the youth, whether it's talking about gender, they're all important groups which need attention going forward. I know I'm taking more time than I think you need, but very quickly.
I actually want to come back to you. So, you've said a lot, and I want to come back to you for so many follow-ups that I've been kind of keeping in my mind. And I also want to kind of bring in Heather, but I also see that we have an illustrator, Santosh. If I could just have that shown. He's been illustrating along the way. We're hoping to have documentation of this session to be visually illustrated as well, to share with the notes. We find it interesting, and it will also help us in the report that we're writing. And Motoshi, sorry to interrupt you, but I really wanted to ensure that we do come back and dive deeper. I do want to probe you a little more on some of the questions. Before that, if I could just come to Heather. Heather, if you could give one line of introduction to what your organization does. And frankly, I ask you the same question, in the sense that, and I would love for you to focus specifically on this issue around adolescence and climate, right? We have heard a lot about justice, climate justice for a lot of other groups, and broadly packaged together in vulnerability. But tell us more about adolescence and climate.
Sure, thanks so much, Shailaja. And I'm actually super excited, Motoshi, to hear the changes you're leading there in the MacArthur strategy. That's really wonderful to hear. I direct the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. We are a 4-year-old fund that pools funds from a number of foundations. And actually, I was excited to see my colleague Diane Ives from the Candida Fund is in the audience here today. She's on our board. Our fund supports women and youth and Indigenous peoples in building their own solutions for climate change. And focusing on women and youth, obviously the intersection of those is adolescent girls. And so we have a number of projects that really target this specific space. We're working in India, mainly in West Bengal and Orissa. We have grants there on the Bay of Bengal, also in Bangladesh. And then we also have grants in East Africa, where the climate issues are quite distinct, but where gender and age are again important factors. Our third geography is the north of North America, Arctic Canada and Alaska. So these are all places where climate change is already really palpable, and it's already having an effect on people and on communities, on lives and livelihoods. I don't want to go too deeply into some of the specifics of girls' vulnerability. I think we heard really great background on that from the first set of panelists. And while there's certainly a lot more to learn out there, there's also a great deal that we already know. So we're interested in really figuring out solution sets, really figuring out ways of engaging girls and responding to their needs and priorities as a funder. And in many respects, not just girls themselves, but the communities and families and societies that they live within. Because really, when you look at climate change, this is such a huge problem. We need everyone's innovation. We need everyone's actions. And to see girls and young women in a situation where they don't have power to contribute to these challenges, this is what we're really focused on. Our fund in general, we say that those hit first are the first to respond and the first to adapt. That's just natural, and they're leaders in this space. So really following the lead of girls, building up the voice and power of girls. This is at the heart for us of climate solutions. Just to speak about kind of two things in terms of when we think about solution sets here. The first is that the kinds of things we have wound up funding, I think, are quite surprising in many respects, because so much of this is about empowering girls, and the things that empower girls aren't always what you might think. We're, obviously young people have a lot of energy to bring to the climate challenge. They have a lot of curiosity. They're physically getting stronger in many cases, and they're often the people in their communities that are kind of out ahead on technology and some community activities. So this is just a sort of an example of some of the strengths that our partners are seeing girls bring to the table. And we see programs, for example, where girls are serving as researchers. They're getting involved in research projects, and they're helping to learn about what the needs are in their communities. They're helping to give voice to what's happening on climate change in their communities. We have a couple of projects where girls are working as journalists. They're working with their community radio stations and really exploring their communities in that way. So that curiosity component, when girls get involved in activities like this, it's an empowering activity for them. It's where they can learn more, they can contribute more. Their communities start to see them in a new way. They're valued for contributions that maybe aren't typical in a lot of cultures and a lot of traditional ways that we think of girls' contributions. For example, when they're involved in a radio program that's helping to get the word out about climate change and helping their communities prepare for a storm or for a drought. This is something new as a role for girls, and it's really exciting in terms of the opportunity for climate change action to be a space where we really address some of the inequalities and the unfairness to girls, where they have a chance to get to know their own rights and to support one another in asserting those rights and claiming those rights. And whether you do this through a radio program, through a soccer team, through any number of ways that girls can get more engaged with each other and with their communities, we don't want to leave that off the table. This is all important in terms of how empowerment happens. Now, the second thing that kind of builds from that is that what we have been finding in our grant making is that there's no one solution, that most of the things that we fund are really integrated activities. This example of a girls' radio club paired with reproductive health education, put together with climate smart agricultural technology, put together with very basic wash interventions, in some cases with activities really aimed at boys and at men in a community, or these things all buttress one another. They integrate together. And don't let me forget the advocacy component, right? Of of communities really raising their voices to authorities, whether that's local governments, whether that's at a national level or at a state level. All of these things need to be linked up together. But you know, we have one grantee partner who had this kind of very integrated, multifaceted proposal to us, and I, you know, I was a very new funder at the time. Actually, it was 4 years ago, and I looked at this and I said, I don't understand this. Where is the climate change in here? You know, most of this is things you've been doing for 30 years. What's new and different here? And he, you know, pointed out a few things that were very new and different, but he ultimately said, look, this is about adolescent girls. This is all about adolescent girls. They are the most vulnerable people in our context. And all of these pieces are coming together to support them in our community, to raise them up in our community in one way or another. And we think all of these pieces are necessary to make that happen. So it's really important for funders to think about this integration, and really smart and strategic integration that's very grounded in knowledge of a specific context. As you know, as noted earlier, if you're in a coastal space or you're in a mountain or you're in a dryland space, that specific integration looks quite different. But some of the puzzle pieces, some of the building blocks, and the need to put those together, that's still the case no matter the context.
Thanks, Heather. You ended at a point where I was anyway going to ask you a follow-up question, which is some direction or indications to other funders. So thank you so much for bringing that in. It's, you know, part of this learning lab is for all of us to learn. And therefore going to you, Matushi, just in a minute, 2 things that you would like to share as a message to other funders. Again, considering that you have taken this bold step of investing in this space, and not just from MacArthur's perspective, as somebody in this space, what are the 2 things that you would bring forth to other funders?
Me? Okay. The good news is that I think it's not just MacArthur, but there's a whole bunch of other funders who in fact started their journey from the mitigation lens as such, are now more interested to see a more human-centric approach, looking at the most vulnerable population. And as Heather mentioned, probably it is the group of adolescent girls that we are sort of zeroing in on here. But those points of intersection are, for us, are still being developed, and we are still trying to figure out exactly where can philanthropic funding can make a difference in this space as such. So that's something that I would like to share, that, you know, there is really a lot more interest in the subject, not just in MacArthur, but across the board. So if there are good ideas bubbling around, just, you know, tell us more about it. We are very happy to listen as we move forward. And also the second thing that I wanted to say is that, you know, in terms of evidence building, and probably this speaks a little to what Namrata had mentioned earlier, you know, it would be good to figure out, you know, what would be the indicators of progress as we move forward. And probably, Heather, you've already done a lot of work in this space. I don't really know, would love to know more about this. But, you know, it would be a good starting point to say that, okay, fine, if we are going down that road, which we definitely are, what are the things that we should be more mindful than others?
Thanks, Matushi. That was useful. And I'm going to loop back to some of the participants. And before I move to my next segment, just quickly summarizing some of this, what I heard a lot from both of you is a lot of factors around agency empowerment, intersectionality within intersectionality. So while we do understand it's a complicated space, we understand it's an urgent need. And along with that, we need to have a multiple solution lens. And at the very crux of that is our community, is our constituent, is our adolescent that we're talking about. So taking that, if I can transition to the next segment. And here we have Laksh Sharma, who's a young person from Fridays for Future lead, Hisham Mandol, the Chief Advisor, India Environmental Defense Fund, and Supriya Singh from ex-president of the India Youth Climate Network. Welcome, everyone. So you all have heard what some of our panelists have said so far. Again, when I was doing some research earlier, just basic Googling, I saw, Lizzie Priya, who's the activist, a young activist in this field. She's a young, I think, 12-year-old climate activist in India. And a lot of her mandate, like I was trying to look up what is the mandate that she's pushing for, what is she asking for, what is her advocacy agenda. And basically it was a one-line agenda, which is to say, dear Prime Minister, please pass the Climate Change Law Act now. And that's pretty much what I saw, a lot of the signs, a lot of the protests, a lot of the advocacy around. It sounds super basic. It sounds absolutely quite essential and simple. And it also looks like across different countries, there's a lot of young people who are taking on this mandate. Tell us a little bit. And first, let me come to Hisham. Hisham, taking off from what Heather said, and I heard some of the earlier panelists also said on this, is that this is for the future of the next generation, right? What are we leaving for them? They feel this need. They are understanding the implications and they're saying, what are y'all doing? Why are y'all not looking at this change urgently and essentially? Tell me, why are we not including young people in the conversations that we're having? Or are we? And what is the way to do that?
Sure. And first of all, thanks for having me and thanks for organizing this. I'm dazzled by how Dasra has been able to pull off this fascinating Dasra this year. So well done, everyone. I want to step back a moment before and address your question. But generation after generation, young people are almost always more informed than previous generations, more active than previous generations, more ambitious and less patient. And that's great. And the more of that we see, the better the future of the world will be. If you look at almost every survey of young people in India, and one of the things, or what is the most important thing for them, it's almost always jobs at the top. And it's jobs because that represents obviously economic advancement, but also social mobility. And that addresses every disadvantaged way that you cut an issue. What I think is the need of the hour is for us to do two things. One is start giving forth a different narrative, because right now, part of the unstated, subtle narrative is progress and prosperity and health and the environment are somehow mutually exclusive. And they're not in conflict. And there has to be a better model and a different model and an Indian model. And there are examples of that emerging in the country, which is fantastic. The second is doomsday scenarios very rarely bring out the best in the human spirit. It terrifies the hell out of us. And sometimes a little bit of terror is what is required. But it doesn't bring out the best in people. And young people, more than anybody else, will not identify with doomsday scenarios. Honestly speaking, if you ask the average young person what may or may not happen by 2050, quite frankly, they don't give a damn what may or may not happen by 2050. We need to present scenarios to them now, which talks about how there is, a low carbon, better health development trajectory that gives them better jobs of the future in industries that will survive with more equal incomes, and that improves quality of life, the security of life, and the very dignity of life. So part of where I'm going to answer your question is I don't think enough young people are engaged, but I also think as a community we have to open up the tent and not necessarily be stuck with talking about gigatons of emissions and the various classifications for it, and talk about how it makes a difference to young people's lives.
So Hisham, just a follow-up question, but quickly, how does it make a difference to young people's lives? Answer me this then.
If we're able and we can, and there's signs that that it is actually happening in reality, showing them that there are green jobs gives them something to aspire and work in education towards. And that green job is hopefully not just in urban areas, but in rural areas. That green job is just as easily and done by a woman as it is by a man. And that green job will survive for the next 10, 20 years and not be made redundant by automation or changing technologies. And jobs is what they want, and jobs is what they are yearning for.
So that's the framing that you're saying is top of mind for young people, I see. And just coming to you, Supriya, taking off from what Hisham says, that we need to engage more young people. But on the flip side, one of the things that okay, this is just an argument, right? We feel young people can't even take care of their own lives. How will they plan the policy agenda for climate change? Right. How do we reconcile this? So let's include them in the conversation, yes, but we are not trusting them. So give us a little more sense of navigating this entire piece to say, yes, get engaged, but will we trust them or no? Will policymakers listen to them or no? What role can they play? Over to you, Supriya.
Thank you very much, Shelja. That's a very interesting question. And, picking up from where Hisham left, I think, yes, youth are definitely looking at jobs. That's like the most important thing in their lives, especially people who are in the university setup, young professionals. So coming from that perspective, when you look at it, when we started the network, the Indian Youth Climate Network, the whole idea was to first understand ourselves. Where is it that we can make a difference, and we realized fairly quickly, we realized that the space where there's absolutely no presence of Indian youth is policy. So when I hear you saying that, a lot of activists say that Prime Minister come out with a climate policy, do they really understand what is it that they want? So that's the ground that formed Indian Youth Climate Network. That's the idea behind getting people together, understanding, decoding national, international policy, getting people together to also see what can be done at what level by whom. So in terms of taking youth seriously, I think India's demographic dividend, more than 65% of our population is below the age of 35. So that demographic dividend, I think, is not being heeded enough, and the youth today do recognize what's going on around them, like it's been pointed out so many times, and they also know what to do about it. But coming from the network space, you realize the importance of these networks, youth networks, even Fridays for the Future or other youth networks that exist, is the fact that there's peer-to-peer learning. The most important thing that happens is this. So today, if I want a job in a bank, and I'm part of a network that's talking about climate change, about how to bring about a change in society in general, what are the policies that affect us? How can I make my dream job a green job? Those conversations, when they happened, that's the point from where people started seeing at jobs from a different light altogether. So we've had youth in the network who've gone on to become entrepreneurs in the energy space and in several other spaces, including retail. So there have been times when they've faced a lot of problems. There have been times when they've been discussing the policies and how they affect all of the issues that we face. And those are the times when people have come together, put their heads together, and got things to the table. So I think the biggest challenge as far as the youth is concerned is that there are no policy discussions when we look at climate change. I think that's the main point of entry whenever you start talking to youth. Why is policy not ever discussed? Lissy Priya, what does she know? How is policy going to help us? So simply stating that let's adopt a climate policy, but a climate policy that's hollow is not going to work. We need to really put out there what is it that we clearly want in terms of our demands from our own government, from the UNFCCC and the others. And those demands can be fairly simple, but at the same time, the biggest learning that IYCN gave me was that the rooting of these demands happens when we go out and we meet our peers. So IYCN started as more or less a urban movement because all of us were in cities and we were coordinating together at one point in time across 19 states in the country, right? But the moment we started going out of this comfort space, the moment we started looking at problems that youth in rural areas face, that women face, that was the moment where we realized that even matters that could be taken up easily at the local level were not being discussed, and that's the space that the youth filled in. So that energy that comes with the, being a youth, that commitment that comes when you are passionate about something, that needs to be channelized, and the youth are pretty capable of channelizing that. I think all we need right now is facilitation of that channelizing. So the biggest idea behind IYCN was to keep it a loose network, because we realized if we were to form it into a formal big NGO or a corporate kind of a setup wherein there is a head and then you have various branches, it will never work. So all of us worked across different chapters in the country on issues that were locally important, and some of us ended up cleaning water bodies. Some of us ended up just talking to people about climate change policies, how the current policies, by the way, are related to climate adaptation and mitigation. And I think that was the biggest achievement within the network. So I think youth can be taken very seriously. I can give you a very short example of how that happened in a project that we did. In a district called Chhatarpur in Madhya Pradesh, we trained only three 18-year-old girls to go around 15 tribal villages and discuss climate change issues with them. They were also trained to look at the kind of policies that the government already has and how can those policies be utilized by these people, programs and policies for their own betterment, for improving agriculture and other such things. What that resulted in after the project ended was this collection of 15 villages who started approaching these girls and our partner NGO in Chhatarpur to help them approach the district administration regarding certain issues. And when the elections were due next year, they decided not to vote for these representatives because agriculture, water, basic sanitation, women's issues were not on their agenda. 15 villages coming together to say no votes for anyone who doesn't have these things on their agenda, I think was a big achievement, considering that it started with just 3 adolescent girls going around these villages, only discussing issues, documenting things, and helping people come to terms with how government policies and programs work on the ground and how can we utilize them. So I think there is power in the spirit of youth itself.
Yes. No, thanks so much, Supriya, for framing it and giving us a real life example. And I'll come back to you on the question of some scale around this. And I will also bring in Hisham, but before that, Laksh. On Monday, as part of the Dasra Philanthropy Week, we had a session on this entire issue, what you touched upon, Supriya, the demographic dividend, the potential and the need to include the voice of young people in what we're doing as a country. We keep calling them the demographic dividend. Okay, we want to harvest the dividend. Okay. But what are we investing to get back from this dividend is really the question. And I want to ask you, Laksh, one of our speakers there, Priyashwara was her name, she said, no decision about us should be taken without us. And that stuck with us, right? Can you tell us, Laksh, a little bit from your perspective? You are part of an organization called Fridays for Future. It's a youth group, a network. What is the value you think that young people can bring to a conversation around climate? Like, what would you say are the top 3 things that a network like yours and individuals like you can bring to that?
So this is a question that gets, in my head quite some time. And the thing is, one of the best things that the youth can do is incentivizing doing good. What do I mean by that? For example, in my city, Delhi, we just did a wall painting session for the upcoming global climate strike. And it engaged people. It engaged the youth, and people that were coming and watching us do the wall art session, they were asking us questions. Why are you doing this? Why is it happening? And as people came in, we were able to tell them about the issues that are in Delhi, you know, the pollution issue, and what are our demands. Because I feel the Indian climate movement is decentralized and it's good, but at the same time, it limits our capacity to take decisions unanimously. And at the same time, what happens because of it is our demands and what we are looking and working towards is different. So that's why in Delhi, specifically the chapter that I work in, I've been working in creating specific demands and specific action points that we want in Delhi from the government, so that, I truly feel there are two aspects to doing something. One is the front end, one is the back end. Back end is the research we do. It's the people we talk to create the demands, the policy experts, the people that we are. Because I feel when youth comes down to it, we can do anything in this world. So we did our research, we talked to policymakers. It was a hectic task because people don't really take us seriously. It's just that they're like, why do we want to learn about, the Yamuna Ridge, or what interest do we have in SPACC? But we're like, we are concerned. It's our city, so we are supposed to work towards it and make it better. So we actually approached them, we got the demands, and it's an open draft. Because at the end of the day, I feel whatever the youth does, it's also without, like the restrictions that come with an organization such as FFF, because we are open, like it's in our motto. Everyone is welcome, everyone is needed. So we keep our demands in the public domain, and everyone can comment and give their opinions. Let it be an expert, let it be a youth activist. You can always pitch in your concerns. So this would be my way of saying incentivizing doing good is the way forward. And I truly feel, because at the end of the day, we are the youth. We are going to be in the workforce, and activism per se will not be able to fund our future. This is a very sad fact, but we still do it by knowing it. Because once we start, thinking about it, and we become smarter and smarter by each going campaign, we kind of realize there are a lot of ways we can do good even without, thinking about these things. And at the same time, the experience that we gain, it's an indirect experience by doing climate activism. For example, when I was talking to the policy researchers, there's this experience that would have helped me do a research paper maybe in the future. So it's indirectly helping us, build our capacity to do things and do good. And at the same time, we are leaving a mark, and people know that, the youth is involved and we are trying to do our best. It's just that we need a bit of a guidance, I feel. That's what's lacking.
No, thank you so much. You've touched on a lot of interesting pieces. First of all, to tell us, what is this SPACC that you mentioned? We don't know that.
Okay. So the thing is, we have a lot
No,
of
just
demands.
a full form.
Okay. So I'm like a bit nervous, so I kind of forgot it.
No,
But
no, that's
yeah,
fine. I don't know enough.
yeah.
Tell us.
So because we have like 20 demands in Delhi, so I don't know them by heart. It's just like I remember it like over on the surface, because when we were doing it,
Okay.
it was
Yeah,
made like 2 or 3 months ago. But yeah, because on the 19th of March we're gonna have a global climate strike, so we have to obviously brush up on the issues. But yeah, there are a lot of issues that are in climate change, and actually, okay, wait a minute. I'll okay.
Yeah. Thanks. Supriya has put it in the chat. No, it's just about knowing that because you said that. And so
state action plan on climate change. State action plan on climate change. Yeah.
Yeah, even I don't know too many academics. We are also jargonized now in this sector. If you ask each of us, we'll have a list of 120 short forms for everything, including Dasra Philanthropy Week. DPW is what we say every time. So I completely understand, Laksh. But just one last question to you again, Laksh. In terms of, you mentioned a very interesting piece, right? Which is the fact that there is a linkage and almost a vocational skill that one is building as part of being an activist, as part of being part of these movements, especially the climate movement. You linked it to the fact that you are gaining some skills that will help you in your jobs. in your job or future for your future preparedness. So I'll come back to that, but taking that in mind, Hisham, that's exactly what you were, I mean, you were framing it in a different way. But if this is, it's understood by the youth, it's understood by practitioners like you, what do you think is the challenge? Why are we not then including youth? Why are we not messaging youth? And to Supriya's point, there is obviously anecdotal small movements that are successful. Why is it not taking off at the scale that it needs to? Give me your analysis.
So one thing that I believe is that a lot of the conversation is somehow assuming that the youth have to learn about an issue, or young people need to learn about an issue before they have the right to speak. It doesn't work that way. Young people, if they care about an issue, will speak and act as they feel they need to do, and that's plenty good. Um, you often talk about the power of one, and how one person can make a difference. And yes, everyone can make a difference in their own rights. One thing that I would like to bring to the table is the power of two. Find anything, however small it is, uh, and organize yourselves with one more person who cares. And don't worry if that results in 50,000 different agendas. Heaven knows, no one knows the formula. Otherwise, we'd have got it right a long, long time ago. I was seeing somewhere the other day that there is a air quality report from 1905 in India. So we were thinking about air quality 1905, and if the older people haven't figured out the solution so far, let many more voices come and talk about the issue. The main thing in things like this is you will never arrive at that perfect solution immediately. The whole idea is the trajectory of progress. If you get things moving and people talk about it, you will eventually get to a place where there is progress. I think one fantastic marker in the most recent elections in Delhi was the fact that air quality became an issue. Now, you can have differences on how you address it, and you should have differences. And we live in a vibrant democracy, and that's great. So don't try and impose one solution over another, but get that topic of conversation up and going. And just to specifically answer your question, be welcoming of different opinions on how to solve the problem. No one of us have that, magic recipe.
Thanks, Hisham. And Supriya, just towards this end of this segment, coming to you, because you did mention, you said youth do have a role to play, a powerful one at that, a central one. And even what Laksh said and what you said is there is some amount, and Hisham as well, there is some amount of capacity building in terms of knowledge that is required, some amount of maybe organization and facilitation to get to the understanding of some of these issues potentially. So in terms of, in your experience, what is the best way in which we can let the young people lead in the front, not take away from them because they need to lead it, it is their movement, but to support them with some of the gaps that emerge in terms of, like we said, facilitation, maybe policy advocacy?
That's a lovely question. We've been trying to figure that out for a long time, even in the network. The best way forward so far has been to collaborate with individuals as well as organizations that can help us with the kind of things that we are doing. And incidentally, Environment Defense Fund has been, a major contributor. So EDF through Richie has been a big support for Indian Youth Climate Network, not only in terms of bouncing the ideas off of what we are doing, but also in terms of how to engage in the policy space. And sometimes just having that conversation in itself is big. So I think number one would be, I would really urge all of us in this space to make space for the youth when they come up to us to ask about something, to just hear them out and help them in whatever way we can. And the second thing would be, in this space, fortunately, a lot of girls and women have been active. And they've helped us contextualize a lot of the issues that we work on very well, be it waste management in climate change, be it community mobilization, or even getting people together to start a project, or even completion of projects that we started out with, writing reports and doing other things. Capacity development, I think, is the most important issue. And the other issue is to keep the movements or keep the youths, in that space together. Instead of trying to bring in somebody from outside, I think we should allow for these youth groups to get that nurture that they need on their own sometimes, and also sometimes in terms of being a guide to them. Many a time some of these campaigns might require some amount of funding, so I think that part people are smart enough these days to cover. So I don't see that as too much of an issue. The government of India has also reached out to us in the past and lent us a hand in many ways. So we've been able to do that. But the final point that I would like to make is, in terms of empowerment, the biggest thing that has been empowering within the youth movement is to see other youth learn and do things that have changed their lives and perspectives altogether. So that aspect of peer-to-peer learning, learning to do things that you want to see around you, this whole idea of be the change you want to see in the world, I think that's changed my perspective quite a lot within the movement as well, because I've seen people take up steps that I thought were probably never possible. uh, they've been able to open their own enterprises. They've been highly successful at those. That said, many youth have even come forward to look at things like consumption, and they've started with themselves how to reduce the consumption that they are doing in their houses. Similarly, in waste management space, a lot of them have entered and have started very successful enterprises now to manage waste at different levels. So I think in terms of the support, I think capacity building is probably the biggest need of the hour. And also that would allow a lot of youths to understand that there's help out there whenever they need it. So it's just a matter of coming together and going for it. And I think people are fortunately quite aware these days, all the youths. And I'll just stop with a small snippet. I had gone to the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change for a meeting in 2019. And there was this group of school students from Fridays for the Future who were standing outside the gate, and they were told not to enter because there was nobody to meet them. They said, "You've not taken an appointment." And these kids just would not let go. They were like, "No, it's all right. Anyone, the minister, the secretary, whoever's available, we would like to meet and put our demands. And that is it. We don't want to do anything else except to meet that person and tell them that we are aware of the issues around us. And we have very simple demands if they could listen to us." I think that is where the power lies. Nobody could shoo them away. They were not being hostile. They were just a bunch of kids who knew what they were saying and they wanted to be heard. So that's also the space, giving youth the space in all of these forums is extremely important. So because these are issues that are most important to the youth, they should be included in all of these forums.
Sure. And Laksha, I just want to bring you in again as part of this forum that you're part of. Do you see the involvement of your fellow peers being girls also? We speak about this issue impacting adolescent girls a lot. In the news, of course, we have Greta and Lizzie Priya, who are girls, but in a slightly more disaggregated, like you said, there are city chapters. Do girls, are they also part of these movements? Do they also work with you all?
Okay, so I'm very happy to, you're very happy that you asked this question, because the thing is, in the movement in Delhi, most of the coordinators that are social media research coordinators are women, and the work that they do, the best work, like, how do I say this? But the best work that is being done in the chapter is being done by the women of our chapter. Let it be the demands that I talked about, they were entirely drafted by our research team coordinator with, like, how do I say this? What was the word? Okay, I'm not getting the word. With the help of other people, and I was not directly involved, but she alone made the entire demands. So that's one thing. And this, I think, climate, advocacy, climate change, climate activism is one of these spaces where women are the ones that are leading the charge. Let it be Dasra and Lysipriya. It's something that I feel that is a place where women are the ones that are taking the charge and, are doing amazing things. So yeah, I would like to see that.
Thanks, Laksh. I mean, frankly, that's music to our ears, right, for everybody. And I wish this was replicated in various ways, not just charge, but an equal partnership, if it were even. Um, and that's interesting. I want to kind of, if we could spotlight Santosh. I know, Hisham, you had mentioned, I'm going to do a little bit of circling back to everyone. If we can go to Santosh, and we also have questions from all of our participants. So now we're moving on to the question answer round. Thank you so much to all of the participants. Like I said, there are a few of you who had sent this in advance, a few questions. And I do see there are some very interesting ones, and we've tried to cull out, and we'll try to have some of the panelists respond to these questions. But I'm just going to go to the notes. Okay. So I will direct these questions to one or two of the panelists, but I'll just read them out first. So one of the questions that came through is, I feel that green jobs are one of the ways to mitigate climate crisis and also help boost economy. Organizations, social enterprises are emerging in India creating these green jobs. But the amount of green jobs and the demand of those jobs has a huge gap. What could be possible ways to reduce this gap and accelerate this reduction in a faster way? So how do we actually match the supply and demand, considering that we're saying green jobs is a solution? However, there isn't enough of demand to employ young people in these green jobs. How do we reconcile that? And I will first come to I think I'll come to Shloka to begin with. If you could help answer this question or frame this argument as well in a way for us, and then I'll bring in the others.
Sure. So I mean, it's a great question. I think it really points to the fact that we obviously, a lot of the discussion tonight has been around capacity building. And I think as India gears towards a greener economy, which is more an inevitability than we realize, it is going to need to upskill or skill its workforce for those priorities and those jobs. And so starting with that capacity building piece, it's really, really crucial at this stage and time, because for change to take place at such a large scale, the scale that we're talking about in terms of really, in some senses, reinventing, the global economy and India's economy, certainly, we do need resources and skills that are going to accelerate the adoption of certain technologies or processes that are going to really change the way our economy currently functions. And we know that India is ripe with talent. We've talked about this tonight. We know that there's a huge demand for skilled labor. So we have to focus on training and capacity building based on, what are the contemporary green practices that we need to push forward that are going to be opportunities for growth in India, as well as, position India as a leader in driving world-class efforts towards climate change. The youth is, ripe in that sense for really sort of taking us forward into that next century.
Yeah, yes, Lynn.
Can I add that I think that there are a lot of solutions that are coming globally on green jobs, and whilst they may not, they may not plug and play in India, I think to create some sort of fora where the knowledge of that can get shared, so that solutions, we can learn from each other. We don't all have to keep reinventing the wheel, even if we need to make local adaptations.
Thanks. Anyone wants to comment on that? Matushi.
No, I mean, just to say, I think where we are seeing the starkest impacts of climate change are not where the jobs are getting created at this point in time. And we do need to map out somewhat better, much better, in fact, in terms of, how do you provide jobs in those areas? I mean, if, one thing that became really, really clear last year with the migrant crisis that we witnessed is that basically it all was sort of seemed to indicate that, people were moving back to their home, home spaces, the villages, the locations, but the jobs were somewhere else. And how do you actually nurture local job creation in local communities where the impact of climate change is really, really the hardest, in fact? And how do you support communities which are going to be most affected through this whole process? And the whole issue of bringing adolescents and the youth at the center of this makes total sense. And we need to figure out, how do you nurture initiatives there in terms of going forward to create the green jobs that are being spoken about.
Thanks, Madhushi. Supriya, and then I'll move on to the next.
Now, I just want to say that, investing more and more in nature-based solutions and green infrastructure, and looking at sectors like agriculture and forestry that already employ a lot of people in the country, and also looking at greening of value chains would create a lot of jobs. And also just redoing what we were doing earlier in a better way, looking at ecotourism in a really green, sustainable way. Making communities in charge of all these areas rather than developing a chain of external agencies that operate in tourist areas. Things like these, I think, would definitely go a long way in creating more green jobs.
Thanks. Thank you. I want to bring in one more question. We'll cover 3 questions overall, and this is a slight shift and an interesting one. So there is a person in chat who has said, sorry, I'm unable to attribute, but says, in my view, as much as climate change is the widely prevalent patriarchal attitudes that are responsible for the life difficulties experienced by adolescent girls, given that there can be no solutions to this without bringing in adolescent and younger boys into the plan, might it not make more sense to focus on the impacts of climate change on young people and to zero in on that, is what this person is trying to say. So patriarchal attitudes, norm shifts, and the implications of that on our young boys and girls, and therefore focusing on that, kind of zeroing in on that. So in that, can I bring you in, Namrata, a little bit? Because when we talk about attitudes, norms, and things like that, again, a question that arises is, how does one measure something like that? What does one look at? What are the indicators towards that? However, you can do all that you want, but unless you are not going to change mindsets, behaviors, how are you going to make sustainable changes? So a little bit to add the flavor around evidence or measurement around that?
Yes, absolutely. So I think one distinction we need to make is that attitudes are different from norms. And most of the measures we have that say we are measuring norms are actually measures of attitude change. And that doesn't really translate to, well, it doesn't relate to behavior, but also does not really affect these informal rules of society, which are norms. So I'm happy to share some resources on, we actually, at the center, we're trying to develop measures of norms, and I'm happy to share some resources on this. But it is, norms measurement is something still on the newer side, I think. And as the person rightly identified, we can't talk about gender equity or climate change or any of these intersections without really understanding the context we're in, which are very, very deeply ingrained gender inequitable norms. That is what we are pushing against. For example, we see women as farmers, but they don't own the land, and the land will never go down to the daughter, it'll go down to the son. So that, that's like one tiny thing that we'll have to, how can we expect for the women to make decisions at home when they don't own the land, or it's always the men deciding when you're going to like sell the produce or all of that. And it's I think that is the real challenge. We can do a lot of work, we can do a lot, but I don't think it's going to make any real difference unless we really just acknowledge that these norms are deeply ingrained, and we'll have to making normative change takes time. Which means your 1-year project, 2-year projects, or your like 18-month follow-up, 36-month follow-up, you may not really see normative change. It's long. It's going to take a long time. I'm sorry, I don't have a better
That's-
answer.
But that's such a good answer in that sense. It a good answer needn't be a simple answer. I think we definitely recognize that. And Heather, just bringing you in because you did say, the struggles, and frankly, thank you for being open enough to talk about your evolvement in grant making, the journey that you went through. Tell us a little bit about this issue around measuring the impact of climate change on adolescents. You spoke about measuring the inputs, which is all of the agencies and the catalyst towards that. But do we invest enough in measuring how it's affecting our adolescents, climate issues?
Yeah, what Namrata just described of the time it takes to see the kind of change that we want and the challenge of having long-term change in norms. We, with a 6-year time horizon as a fund and grants that are typically 2, 3, 4 years, you're not really able to measure those impacts necessarily. And so the more important thing is to get really clear around the pathway that we're trying to establish, and then gathering stories and examples of progress along that pathway. So, a lot of the midterm review that we just had done really was just getting at the very beginning of that, with some examples and stories from our portfolio of where we're seeing some shifts. I feel like the last comment we heard from Laksh around Fridays for Future and that attitude of a young man here toward his young woman colleagues, that's the kind of initial example you can see in attitude change. Whereas, okay, a generation from now, that change in attitude has its impact on norms. So it's tricky as a funder, and we just have to be in a position as much as we can of thinking clearly around what we're trying to do, listening and looking for progress, and then being open when things aren't working and being adaptive so that we can change tactics when we see that, oh, this thing that looked really good didn't maybe turn out quite so well.
Thanks, Heather. And just Hisham, I know I hadn't given you space to speak earlier, but anything you want to say?
I just wanted to bring it back to something that Laksh had spoken about on the power of positive incentives. And I want to talk about two parts. One is the power of this incentive, and the second is not to underestimate the power that every single young person has. And that power comes in different forms. For example, there is the power of the wallet. You get to decide which products to buy or not buy based on how you regard and assess a company's environmental standards. And when they do well, reward them with your purchase. Don't underestimate the power of voice that you have on social media. Those handles of yours are listened to and analyzed by corporates. If a bureaucrat does a good job somewhere, reward her or him, by acknowledging it publicly. Just, we have right now the technology tools at our disposal to unleash the energy of school clubs and university politics and onto the world. And I make these points in terms of the positive incentives because there's a quote I have heard the other day: you can't kick someone towards you, and we need to move forward together. And so as much of those rewards that we can give out would be powerful.
Thank you so much. And as I end, I want to come to you, Laksh. What do you have? So we've been talking about actually you through this whole conversation, young people, which is you are representing young people, so no pressure. But what would you like to say as a young person, and unfortunately the only young person on this panel? What is it that you would like to say? What kind of message do you want to leave with us?
So one thing I'd like to say is, okay, I'll just give an example how FMF Delhi internally works. Okay, and then lead into the thing. The thing is, I as a person have to manage 2 internships just to fund the organization that I'm doing with my studies and all. And the thing is, it's not about the funds that is the problem. It's the thing that it should be consistent, because if I am gone, what will happen? I am the sole person that is responsible for everything. So the thing is, what I feel is very important is capacity building. The capacity, that people can, like, you can impart on the youth on how to lead things, how to create feedback loops that sustain themselves, so that even when leaders are gone, the movement keeps going. So this is something that I would like. It's capacity building and knowledge sharing that can, accelerate us towards a better future.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So well said. And so with that, I'm just going to sum up the session. I'm not going to sum up, I'm going to end with a few things, because there's no way I can sum up such an interesting conversation. 2 things I want to say. One is that we're very proud to have had this conversation today, right? It's one of its kind. I think we haven't really explored this conversation, these kind of implications, these interlinkages and intersectionalities. So thank you everyone for rolling up your sleeves and coming to the table, despite us not having some major presentation with evidence-backed evaluations that talk about this. Really, this is, again, like I said, a call to action to bring in collaboration, to invest in data, to ensure that we keep this conversation going and not let it die here, because it is something I hope that you take back, each of you, not only on this panel, but all of these participants. And, just borrowing some of the words that we've heard and thoughts that we have heard. One, we do recognize that youth has created a public awareness and urgency on the climate issue in the last 3 years that scientists over the last 20 years have not been able to. They have made us sit up and listen, is what I heard. And clearly, nobody can deny the potential and the power that young people have to make their own future safer, healthier, happier. Let's provide them just the platforms, the facilitation, the networks, and the ability, the voice, so that their voice can be heard, so that they can lead the change that they want to see. So thank you very much. And I want to also acknowledge all of the participants who have been posting a lot of interesting resources here. We will take this back. We'll try and collate it and send it back to the group. Thank you very much, Santosh. We will also look at documenting this and bringing it back. I don't want any of you to go till you do one last step. Thank you for bearing with me so far, but there is a poll that is coming your way, a quick feedback poll. It will not take you more than 30 seconds. Do not leave till you fill that in. Once you fill that in, you are free to exit. Thank you so much, participants, speakers, everyone here, and the Dasra team. Thank you.